journey and let's talk environmental racism. Back in the day, there was a neighborhood here in Milwaukee named Brownsville, and you may or may not have heard of it before. Brownsville was a thriving black community and home to many black-owned businesses, all the way from hotels and restaurants to embroideries and barbershops. Not only that, but Brownsville was especially known for their music scene, specifically jazz. They even had their own mayor. Although it was unofficial, the community was flourishing and honestly had a lot going for them. But the bad news is it all got destroyed. In the blink of an eye, all of those businesses and homes were gone. And you must be wondering why, right? Well, in the 1960s, the construction of Interstate 43, which is a 191-mile-long highway here in Wisconsin, ruined the lively neighborhood, along with many others. The construction of I-43 destroyed about 17,000 homes and 1,000 businesses. Imagine all of the families that were affected by this, left displaced with nowhere to go. I-43 was built through the north side of Milwaukee, where a lot of black people lived, and still do now. A housing activist by the name of Jeff Egan says that the highway planners targeted black communities where their political power was the weakest, meaning that they barely had a say at all. I-43 allowed white people who had the money for vehicles and suburban living to travel back and forth between the inner city and the suburbs. Suburban areas lacked transportation, so they needed a way to get to and from work. Black people, sadly, were not privileged enough to enjoy these luxuries. They could only afford to be in the inner city, where housing was cheaper and public transportation was available. But even after all of this, there still is hope. There have been plans in the works of having Brownsville rebuilt and having that beautiful community here once again. Now, let me tell you a story. In the 1980s, there was a man by the name of Robert Burns, who was the owner of a New York trucker company. And that man, he had an agenda. He wanted to be known as America's PCB king. You may be wondering what PCB is. PCB is short for polychlorinated biphenyls, which is a man-made chemical that has carbon, hydrogen, and chlorine atoms. He planned to gather these toxic chemicals and sell them to other companies for profit. Robert Burns reached out to a friend who's also named Robert, but his last name is Ward, so we're going to address them as Burns and Ward. Ward was the owner of his own company, which stores thousands of gallons of PCB oils in a warehouse near Raleigh, North Carolina. Eventually, the plan to become the PCB king of America ended up failing. It cost them way too much to transfer hundreds of 55-gallon drums of PCB liquids to a storage facility in Pennsylvania. So, now, what are they going to do with the liquids that they've acquired? Well, Burns had an answer for you. They're going to dump it. They first decided to dump the liquid in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, but the soil didn't absorb the liquid. So they needed to find a new place, right? Burns had Ward's son, Randall and Timothy, spray the PCB oil along Royal, North Carolina roads. And over the course of more than 3 months, the sons went and they slowly poisoned an area spanning 14 counties with 30,000 gallons of PCB oils. It's outrageous, right? How were they able to just throw out these chemicals? Well, rest assured, they ended up getting caught. They left a 211-mile-long stain, and the state did not let that slide. All of them, including the sons, who were all white, might I add, were convicted and sentenced for committing an environmental crime. They decided to dump for environmental crime. Now, with this huge toxic mess, North Carolina now needed a place to dump these chemicals, right? Well, they decided to dump 10,000 truckloads of cancer-causing PCB contaminated dirt in a poor black farming area. And, of course, this struck outrage in this black farming community, and a man by the name of Ben Chavez influenced protests on the North Carolina streets. And he's said to be the one to come up with the term environmental racism. Their protesting ended up getting attention in different states, and more than 500 people were arrested during these protests. But sadly, the cries and fights for North Carolina to stop dumping these toxic oils were never heard by their officials, and they ended up losing their fight. A study done by the Clean Air Task Force says that African Americans are exposed to 38% more polluted air than white Americans, and that they are 75% more likely to live in communities that border a plant or factory. A man by the name of Walter Fauntroy commissioned a 1983 federal report that showed 3 out of 4 landfills in the South were surrounded by black communities. A man named Charles Lee, who was a Chinese American researcher, read this federal report and knew that this topic needed more attention. He and some others began to make the first major study of the environmental justice era. The study was published in 1987, and it found that communities with greater minority percentages of the population are more likely to be the sites of commercial hazardous waste facilities. But in the report, you should know that they never used the term environmental racism. Instead, they used the term environmental injustice. Oh, and that was no accident. Bernice Miller Travis, who also worked on this report, says that everybody wasn't comfortable with racism, so they used the term environmental injustice instead. Well, throughout this JED talk, I talked about 2 environmental racism situations from the past, so how about we get into the present now? Have you ever heard of Cancer Alley? It's an area of predominantly black neighborhoods that stretches 85 miles along the Mississippi River between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. This area got the nickname Cancer Alley for its high concentration of industrial plants, long-term air pollution, and its high rates of cancer for those who live there. Cancer Alley already has more than 150 petrochemical plants built, but companies are still trying to build more and more. There have been recent news in the media that show residents there fighting for clean air, and even the U.S. Justice Department suing companies. Now, during this whole JED talk, I told you about 3 cases of environmental racism now. Although 2 of the 3 have happened in the past, one did hit close to home, and another case is still being fought for to this day. Environmental racism is still very much a thing, especially in areas where minorities tend to live. 9 million people die of air pollution a year, and sadly, a lot of the deaths are from minority groups. And with all of the information that I've given you today, I really just want you all to know environmental racism is real.
Caca!